Ethan Cole grabbed a stranger's wheelchair off the asphalt with his bare hands and threw himself in front of oncoming traffic to shield her body with his own. He had 23 minutes left before the interview that could save his daughter from homelessness. He missed it anyway. What he never saw coming, the woman bleeding on the ground, the one he'd just risked his life for, was the exact person he'd been trying to meet all morning. Drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Subscribe and hit the bell. You won't want to miss what happens next. The alarm went off at 5:47 a.m., 13 minutes before it was supposed to. Ethan Cole didn't move right away. He lay on his back in the dark, staring at the water stain on the ceiling above his bed, the one shaped like a hand reaching for something just out of frame, and he counted his breathing the way the grief counselor had taught him 3 years ago, back when he was a different man, living what felt like someone else's life. 4 counts in, hold, 6 counts out. It didn't help the way it used to, but it gave him something to do besides panic. He rolled out of bed slowly, careful not to wake Ava through the thin wall that separated their rooms. She had cried herself to sleep again last night. He'd heard her muffled sobs through the drywall and had pressed his palm flat against the wall in the dark, the way he used to hold her hand when she was a baby, and couldn't understand why the world was so loud. He hadn't gone in. He didn't know what to say anymore. What do you tell an 8-year-old girl who asks every night whether the two of you are going to be okay? The truth, that they had 11 days left on their lease and $412 in a checking account. That the landlord had stopped returning calls because he already knew what was coming. No. You press your hand against the wall. You breathe. And you promise yourself that tomorrow will be different. Today, Ethan had decided was going to be different. He ironed his shirt twice. It was the only button-down he owned that didn't have a fraying collar, a white Oxford he'd bought 4 years ago for his wife's cousin's wedding. He'd worn it 3 times since. He ironed out the fold lines with the precision of a man diffusing something, moving the iron in slow, deliberate strokes across the fabric stretched over the kitchen counter because they didn't own an ironing board. He checked his tie in the reflection of the microwave door. It was a little crooked. He straightened it. He looked like a man trying very hard to look like someone who had his life together. He supposed that was close enough. The folder on the counter held everything: 2 printed copies of his resume, a list of references, a 1-page summary of the maintenance logistics work he'd done for 7 years before the layoffs, and a handwritten note to himself at the top that said, "Don't apologize for anything before they ask." The interview was at Sinclair Global, 42nd floor of the Sinclair Tower on Michigan Avenue. He had applied on a Tuesday night after Ava fell asleep, sitting at the kitchen table with the laptop balanced on a stack of library books. The job posting had said Facilities Operations Manager. He'd read the description 3 times and quietly admitted to himself that he was probably underqualified. Then he'd submitted the application anyway because underqualified and trying was still better than qualified and giving up. The callback had come 8 days later. He had taken the call in the parking lot of Ava's school, sitting in a car that needed new brake pads he couldn't afford. And when the woman on the other end said, "Ms. Sinclair would like to meet with you personally," he had exhaled so slowly and completely that for a moment he thought he might deflate entirely. He hadn't told Ava about the interview. He didn't want her to hope yet. Hope in their apartment had a way of going sideways. He made her breakfast before she woke up. Scrambled eggs, a piece of toast orange juice from the carton. He set it on the table with a paper towel folded into a triangle beside the plate, the way she liked it, because Lily used to do that: fold the napkin into a triangle and tuck it under the edge of the plate, like they were dining somewhere that mattered. Ava came out of her room in her socks, hair still tangled from sleep, wearing the oversized t-shirt that used to be Lily's. She stopped when she saw him standing in the kitchen in his ironed shirt and tie. "Dad." She looked him up and down. "You look different." "I have a meeting today," he said. "An important one." She sat down at the table and picked up her fork. She studied the eggs for a moment. "Is it about money?" she asked. Not accusatory, just careful. The way children become careful when they've heard too many adult conversations through walls. He wanted to say no. He wanted to protect her from that word, from the weight of it, the way it had started to occupy every corner of their apartment, like furniture they couldn't move. "It's about a job," he said. "A good one. I just need them to give me a chance." She looked up at him. 8 years old, dark eyes shaped like her mother's. "They will," she said simply, and went back to eating her eggs. He stood there for a second longer than he meant to. "They will." 2 words. Absolute. No doubt in them at all. He thought, "God, I don't deserve this kid." He left the apartment at 7:41 a.m., with his folder tucked under his arm and his last good shoes wiped down with a damp cloth. The interview was at 9:15. He had given himself enough time to take the L walk the 6 blocks from the station to the tower, find the lobby, compose himself, review his notes on a bench somewhere, and arrive upstairs exactly 8 minutes early, professional without seeming desperate. He had planned this the way a general plans a campaign. He had walked the route twice the week before. He knew where every construction barrier was. He knew which crosswalks were slow. He had not planned for the rain. It started as a drizzle somewhere around Roosevelt, the kind of quiet Chicago rain that comes sideways and somehow manages to be wetter than physics should allow. By the time he was walking north on Michigan Avenue at 8:52, the drizzle had become something more committed, and the folder under his arm was developing opinions about moisture. He pressed it tighter against his body and walked faster. His phone said 9 minutes. He could still make it. He was going to make it. He heard the impact before he saw it. Not a crash exactly. More like a hollow, violent thud, the sound of something solid hitting pavement at speed, followed immediately by screaming. He stopped. Everyone around him stopped. At the corner of Michigan and Wacker, 30 feet ahead, a black luxury wheelchair had been clipped by a town car that had jumped the curb, taking a turn too fast. The chair had spun and overturned. A woman in a black suit lay on the wet asphalt beside it, one arm braced beneath her, the other reaching for the chair's frame, unable to right herself. Traffic was still moving in the adjacent lane. A bus was coming. Ethan looked at the bus. He looked at the woman. He looked at the folder in his hand. 2 copies of his resume, his references, his handwritten note at the top that said, "Don't apologize for anything before they ask." He dropped the folder on the sidewalk, and he ran. Beg. He didn't think about it. That was the honest truth, and he would turn it over in his mind 100 times in the weeks afterward, trying to locate the decision, trying to find the moment he chose. He never could. There was no moment. There was the bus, and there was the woman, and there was his body already moving before his brain had finished forming the sentence. He hit the crosswalk at a sprint, nearly took down a man in a raincoat who was frozen at the curb, and reached her in what felt like 4 steps. "I've got you," he said. It was the only thing that came out. He grabbed the overturned chair with both hands, pulled it upright, locked the brake with his foot, the way he'd seen someone do once in a video he barely remembered watching. Then he bent down to her. She was on her side, dark hair plastered across her face. One hand pressed to the asphalt. Her suit jacket had torn at the shoulder. She was not crying. She was not screaming. She was doing something harder than both. She was fighting silently and furiously to get herself up off the ground with nothing but her arms, because her legs would not cooperate, and the wet pavement gave her nothing to push against. "Don't," he said. I don't need the bus." She heard it then, the low hydraulic groan of the bus braking behind him. Something shifted in her face. Just for a second. Something that wasn't fury. "Okay," she said, very quiet. He got one arm under her shoulders and the other beneath her knees, and he lifted her. She was lighter than he expected and heavier than she seemed, and he stepped backward out of the lane in 2 long strides and deposited her as carefully as he could into the wheelchair that he'd already locked and repositioned on the sidewalk. The bus passed the spot where she'd been lying, close enough that he felt the air displacement against his back. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The rain continued. A small crowd had formed on the sidewalk and now stood back at a polite, guilty distance. The crowd that appears after a crisis has already been resolved by someone else, relieved they hadn't been needed. He crouched down in front of the chair so he was at her level. Old habit. He'd learned it from Ava. Don't stand over someone who's already feeling small. "Are you hurt?" he asked. She looked at him. Cold, dark eyes. The kind of composed that takes years to build. "My shoulder," she said. "I'm fine." She was not fine. He could see it in the set of her jaw, the careful way she was holding herself, the slight tremor in her left hand that she was working very hard to suppress. "You should let someone look at that," he said. "I have a meeting in 40 minutes. "So do I," he said. And then, because it was true, and because the absurdity of it was already becoming visible around the edges of the situation, "I'm already late." Something crossed her face that might in a different woman at a different moment have been amusement. Her assistant appeared from somewhere, a young woman in a soaked blazer practically sprinting from the direction of the parking garage, phone pressed to her ear, her face white with something between terror and relief. "Miss Sinclair. Oh God, are you? I'm so sorry, I was getting the umbrella from the car and the driver." "I'm fine, Sophie," the woman said. Calm, absolute, like a building settling back onto its foundation. "Stop apologizing." Ethan stood up. Sinclair. He heard the name and felt something move strangely through him. The way you hear a word in a foreign language and almost recognize it. "Ms. Sinclair," Sophie said, turning briefly toward Ethan with the frantic energy of someone tying off a loose end. "Should I get this man's information for a thank you or—" "I'll handle it, Sophie." Victoria Sinclair looked at Ethan for the first time without the emergency between them. Direct. Measuring. "What's your name?" "Ethan," he said. "Ethan Cole." Something happened in her eyes. The briefest recalibration. So fast he almost missed it. "Ethan Cole," she repeated slowly. "Yes, ma'am." "You have a meeting this morning." "I did." He glanced at his phone. 9:04 a.m. "I'm going to be late." "At Sinclair Global," she said. Not a question. He stared at her. "Your resume is blowing down the street," she said, nodding past him. He turned. One of the printed copies had escaped the folder and was now skidding across the wet pavement in the wind, the white paper flipping and tumbling toward the gutter like something trying to escape. He didn't move to chase it. He turned back. "You're her," he said. It came out quieter than he intended. Victoria Sinclair looked at him for a long moment. The rain came down between them. Someone in the crowd behind him said something into a phone. A car horn sounded 2 blocks north. "Come upstairs," she said finally. Her voice had shifted, not softer exactly, but different. The way a door sounds when someone unlocks it from the inside. "Don't be late to your own interview, Mr. Cole." Dead. He retrieved the folder from the gutter. One copy of the resume was gone. The other was damp at the edges, but legible. He straightened his tie in the reflection of the lobby's glass doors. It was still crooked. He went in anyway. Because somewhere upstairs in an office, he hadn't yet stood in a woman who had just been lying on wet asphalt, was already back in her chair, already composing herself, already building the walls back up, and she had told him to come up. And Ethan Cole, a man who had given up on luck a long time ago, was starting to wonder if that word still applied to him at all. He stepped into the elevator. The doors closed, and everything, absolutely everything, was about to change. The 42nd floor of Sinclair Global smelled like money and quiet judgment. Ethan stepped off the elevator into a reception area that made him instantly aware of every single thing wrong with his appearance. The damp collar, the folder with the waterlogged edges, the left shoe that had picked up a smear of something gray from the crosswalk. He stood still for a moment, taking it in, the kind of stillness that isn't confidence, but is sometimes mistaken for it. The receptionist looked up, young, precise, the kind of expression that had been professionally trained to reveal nothing. "Ethan Cole," he said. I have a 9:15 with Ms. Sinclair's team. The receptionist typed something, paused, typed again. You're 14 minutes late, Mr. Cole. I'm aware, he said. There was an incident on Michigan Avenue. I see. She picked up the phone, said something quietly into it, set it back down. Someone will be with you shortly. You can wait there. She gestured toward a row of chairs that probably cost more than his monthly rent. He sat. He opened the damp folder on his lap and looked at the single surviving copy of his resume. He'd written it at the kitchen table at 11:30 at night, with Ava asleep down the hall, trying to make 7 years of facilities work sound like something a billionaire's company would want. He'd used words like operational efficiency and cross-functional coordination and stakeholder communication, which was a formal way of saying he'd kept broken buildings running with half the budget and twice the problems, and he'd done it without losing his temper or his crew. He wondered now if any of that would matter. He was sitting in that thought when the voices came around the corner. Not loud, but not bothering to be quiet either. The particular volume of men who've never had to lower it. Pulled from the shortlist by Sinclair herself, apparently. Personally requested. You're joking. Him. That's what Sophie said. The guy from the street this morning. The one who... The chair thing, that was him. Apparently. A pause, then drier. So we're interviewing a man because he performed a Good Samaritan act for the CEO. Great. That's the new bar. Relax. She probably just wants to thank him in person. It won't go anywhere. Ethan didn't move. He kept his eyes on the resume in his lap. He read the same bullet point 4 times without absorbing a single word. They came around the corner a moment later, 2 men in their 50s in suits that fit the way suits fit when someone else chooses them for you. They clocked him immediately. He saw it. The quick scan, the almost imperceptible recalibration. The taller one extended a hand. Mr. Cole, I'm Richard Hale, VP of Operations. This is Dennis Park, Director of Facilities Management. Ethan stood, shook both hands. Ethan Cole. We'll be conducting the initial interview, Hale said pleasantly. The pleasantness was a technique, not a feeling. Ms. Sinclair may join us depending on her schedule. You understand, after this morning's events, she has a great deal to catch up on. Of course, Ethan said. They led him into a conference room. Glass walls, long table, 8 chairs that no one was sitting in except the 3 of them at one end, which was either an accident of scheduling or a deliberate spatial choice designed to make a job applicant feel outnumbered. Ethan had worked in enough corporate buildings to know it was rarely an accident. He set his folder on the table, folded his hands, waited. Hale opened with the easy ones. Background, experience, previous employers. Ethan answered each one directly without padding the way he'd practiced. He watched Hale take notes on a legal pad and Park watch him the way you watch something you've already decided about. Then Park leaned forward slightly. Mr. Cole, your resume indicates you have no post-secondary degree. That's correct. And your most recent position was with... Park glanced down Meridian Property Services, a mid-size building management company. Yes. Not exactly enterprise-level experience. No, Ethan agreed. It's not. Park waited as if expecting him to fill the silence with apology or elaboration. Ethan didn't. He'd written himself a note specifically about that. Sinclair Global manages 14 properties across 3 states, Park continued. The operational complexity here is significant. We have vendors' compliance requirements, union contracts, I understand. Do you? Not hostile, just honest about its own hostility. Ethan looked at him steadily. I managed a 12-building portfolio for 6 years with a team of 9 and an annual maintenance budget that got cut by 30% 2 years running. We maintained full occupancy compliance throughout. I don't have a degree. I have the actual experience of keeping things running when the resources aren't there and the timeline isn't friendly. He paused. I'm not going to pretend I'm something I'm not, but I'd like the chance to show you what I actually am. Hale and Park exchanged a look. The kind that happens above someone's head when they think you can't see it. Ethan had seen it before. It was the look that preceded a polite rejection dressed up as a process. He was already constructing the walk back to the elevator in his mind when the conference room door opened. Victoria Sinclair came in. She moved the chair with the practiced efficiency of someone who had long since stopped thinking about it. The slight lean forward, the push, the controlled stop beside the head of the table. Her suit jacket had been changed. The shoulder that had hit the pavement this morning was hidden under fresh fabric. She had repaired everything external. The expression was back in place, the hair, the composure, but Ethan had seen what was underneath it this morning, flat on wet asphalt, fighting to rise on arms alone. And that image was not something he could quite unsee. "Gentlemen," she said by way of acknowledging Hale and Park. Then she looked at Ethan. "Mr. Cole." "Miss Sinclair." He didn't stand. He wasn't sure if that was right or wrong. He did it anyway. She settled beside the table, looked briefly at the legal pad in front of Hale, looked back at Ethan. "How's the interview going?" she asked. It was a simple question, but it had a weight to it that Ethan understood immediately. She already knew the answer. She was testing whether he did too. "Honestly," he said, "I think Mr. Park has already made up his mind." Park made a sound that was technically not a protest. Victoria's expression didn't change, but something moved behind her eyes. A very small thing, like a light passing under a closed door. "Richard, Dennis." She said their names the way people say words that end conversations. "Give us a few minutes." Hale began to say something, stopped. Both men gathered their things and left with the coordinated discomfort of people who've been dismissed professionally enough times to have stopped making it obvious. The door closed. Victoria and Ethan sat across from each other in the empty conference room. She studied him with the frank, unsettling attention of someone accustomed to reading people for survival rather than pleasure. He held it, didn't look away, didn't smile to soften the silence. "Why did you do it?" she asked. "The interview," he said. "Because I need the job." "This morning," she said, "on the street." He thought about it. Not performing the thinking, actually doing it, going back to that moment on the crosswalk, trying once more to locate the decision that hadn't felt like a decision. "There was a bus," he said finally, "and you were in the way of it. There were 30 other people on that sidewalk. I know. None of them moved. I know that too." She leaned forward slightly. "So why did you—" He looked at her for a moment. Then he said simply, "I have a daughter, 8 years old. Her name is Ava." He paused. "I think about the kind of person I want her to see when she looks at me. Most days I don't feel like I'm measuring up to it. But that was a moment where the choice was obvious." He shrugged once. "I just made it." Victoria was quiet. Ethan watched her absorb that. He couldn't tell what she was doing with it. Her face was extraordinary in its control. Every expression rationed, nothing given away that hadn't been budgeted for. But there was something in the stillness of it, the particular quality of her silence, that felt less like coldness, and more like someone who hasn't been spoken to honestly in a very long time and isn't sure how to receive it. "You're a widower," she said. It wasn't a question. Sophie had probably briefed her on everything in the file. 3 years, he said. "I'm sorry." "So am I." He said it without drama, just the plain truth of it. She looked down at the folder in front of him. The damp edges, the single remaining resume inside. "Your file says you were the top candidate on paper before the degree issue eliminated you from the standard shortlist," she said. "Then I had Sophie restore your application. I didn't know that." "I know you didn't." She looked up. "The executives you just met with, they don't think I should be making personnel decisions based on personal gratitude. They're probably right, technically." "Are you?" he asked. "Making it based on gratitude." She considered him. "No," she said. "I'm making it based on the fact that every person in a leadership position I've encountered in the last 10 years, including the 2 men who just left this room, would have stayed on the sidewalk this morning. Not because they're bad people." She said it without judgment, as a simple data point. Because they calculate first and act second. And the problems I'm dealing with inside this company right now require someone who does it the other way around. Ethan wasn't sure what to say to that, so he didn't say anything. I'm going to be direct with you, Mr. Cole, Victoria continued. Because I don't have the patience for the other kind. She straightened a paper in front of her that didn't need straightening. A small human gesture. The first one. I run this company alone. I have since my father died 6 years ago, and left it to me over the furious objections of a board that thought a woman in a wheelchair was a PR liability. I've spent every day since proving that assessment wrong. I am very good at what I do. She paused. I am also at this particular moment dealing with something inside my operations division that I do not yet have enough information to name. Contracts that don't add up. Numbers that move in ways they shouldn't. I need someone in that division I can trust. Not because they went to business school, because they're actually trustworthy. The room was very quiet. That's a lot to put on a facilities manager, Ethan said carefully. Yes, she agreed. It is. Why me? She looked at him the way she'd looked at him from the asphalt this morning, direct, unguarded for just a fraction of a second before the armor went back up. Because you dropped your folder, she said. He didn't follow that immediately. You had a job interview, the most important meeting of your life by all appearances, and when you saw me in the street, you dropped the folder and ran. You didn't hesitate. You didn't look for someone else to handle it. She met his eyes. Do you know how rare that is? In this building, in this industry, at this level? She shook her head slightly. People here calculate the cost of every single action before they take it. Everything is a transaction. Everything is leverage. Her voice didn't harden. If anything, it did the opposite. I'm tired of it. Ethan sat with that. Outside the glass walls of the conference room, he could see the assistants moving the phones being answered, the industry of a company continuing its rotation around this woman at the center of it. She had built all of this. And she sat inside it like someone who had constructed a very beautiful, very sophisticated cage and was only recently beginning to notice the bars. I have a question, he said. She nodded. The two men who just left, Hale and Park. How long have they been with the company? Something shifted in her face. Subtle, but real. Hale, 11 years. Park, 8. She watched him. Why? The conversation I heard them having in the hall. Ethan said, before the interview started, the way they talked about me, the way they talked about you. He kept his voice even, not accusatory. Do the people running your operations division actually respect your authority, or do they manage you? The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the ones before it. Heavier, with more living in it. Victoria did not answer immediately. She looked at him the way someone looks at a person who has said out loud the thing that everyone else in the room already knows but has agreed collectively and without discussion not to say. That, she said, finally quietly, is exactly the right question. She extended her hand across the table. You start Monday, Mr. Cole. He shook it. Her grip was firm. The hand of someone who had held on to things under pressure for a very long time. One condition, he said. She raised an eyebrow, almost imperceptibly. People probably didn't attach conditions to her job offers. I have a daughter, he said. School pickup is at 3:15. I'll make up every hour. I'll work early, stay late, whatever the job needs. But 3:15, that's non-negotiable. Victoria looked at him for a long moment, and something in her expression did something he didn't quite have a name for yet. Something that wasn't business and wasn't gratitude, and wasn't the composed professional distance she wore like armor. It was smaller than all of that. More private. 3:15, she said, non-negotiable. He nodded. She looked back at the papers in front of her, and he understood the meeting was over. He gathered his damp folder, stood. He was almost to the door when she spoke again. "Mr. Cole." He turned. She was looking at her desk, not at him, as if the words were easier that way. "What you did this morning," she said. "On the street." A pause, very small. I'm not accustomed to people." She stopped, started differently. "Thank you." He looked at her for a moment. The woman who had rebuilt her entire exterior by the time she'd reached the 40th floor. The woman whose hand had trembled slightly on the wet asphalt when she thought no one was paying close enough attention. "You're welcome," he said, and meant it without ceremony. He took the elevator back down alone. In the lobby, he stood still for a moment. Outside, through the glass, Michigan Avenue moved in its usual Friday rhythm. Cabs, pedestrians, a food cart, the city doing what the city does, without acknowledgement of any individual story happening inside it. He picked up his phone and typed a message to Ava's after-school program coordinator, letting her know he'd be on time for pickup today after all. Then he stood there a moment longer. He'd walked into this building this morning expecting to fight for a chance. He hadn't expected to feel somewhere underneath the exhaustion and the damp suit and the surviving copy of his resume something unfamiliar and fragile that it took him a moment to identify. It was the sensation of a door opening. Not to a job, not to a paycheck or a rescued lease or a checking account that no longer read $412, to something harder to name. Something he hadn't let himself look directly at in 3 years, because looking at it felt like betraying the weight of everything he'd lost. He walked out through the glass doors into the Chicago air. The rain had stopped. The sun was making a tentative, unconvinced appearance between the buildings. Ethan Cole buttoned his jacket, tucked the folder under his arm, and started walking toward the L. He had a daughter to pick up, and for the first time in a long time he was not simply walking away from something. He was walking toward it. He started on a Monday the way he'd said he would. He arrived 40 minutes early, which was not something he'd announced or planned to make a point of. It was simply the time the L dropped him 2 blocks away, and he had no reason to stand on the sidewalk. Burning 40 minutes, he could spend learning the building. He used his new key card for the first time at 7:22 a.m. and spent the next 38 minutes walking every floor of the operations division he'd been assigned, introducing himself to the maintenance staff and the overnight security team, clocking out memorizing which stairwells connected where, cataloging the things that were subtly wrong, the HVAC panel on 12 that had a bypass sticker on it that someone had put there and never removed, the loading dock schedule posted on the wall that was 6 weeks out of date, the storage room on 9 whose lock had been drilled out and replaced with a padlock that none of the facility keys fit. He wrote all of it down in a small notebook he'd bought at the Walgreens near the apartment on Sunday night. Nothing dramatic, just observations. The habit of a man who'd learned early that the things nobody mentions are usually the things that matter most. Richard Hale found him on the 9th floor at 7:58 a.m. "You're here early," Hale said. The pleasantness from the interview was still present, but thinner now, stretched over something less accommodating. "Habit," Ethan said. He looked at the drilled lock on the storage room. "Who has the key to this room?" Hale glanced at it. "Facilities supply closet. Building services should have a key." "They don't," Ethan said. "I asked." A beat. "Then it's probably with the operations supervisor." "Dennis Park." "Possibly." Hale's voice had developed a faint quality. Ethan recognized the tone of someone answering questions they'd prefer weren't being asked. "I can look into it." "I'd appreciate that," Ethan said pleasantly. He closed his notebook. "What time does the morning briefing start?" 8:30, Conference B. "I'll be there." Hale left. Ethan stood in the hall for a moment longer looking at the padlocked door. Then he wrote something else in his notebook and went to find coffee. The morning briefing was 9 people around a table, which told Ethan within the first 4 minutes exactly who reported to whom, who was afraid of whom, and who was performing confidence they didn't actually own. He had sat in enough rooms like this over enough years to read the architecture of a team, the way some people read a room's furniture instinctively without meaning to, and almost always accurately. Park ran the meeting. He was efficient and crisp and spoke in a clipped shorthand that suggested these briefings had long since calcified into ritual. Everyone saying the expected thing in the expected order, with the expected level of urgency, which was to say very little. Nothing surfaced that wasn't already surfaced. No problems admitted that weren't already known. The whole thing had the quality of a rehearsed performance given to an audience that wasn't actually watching. Ethan listened and said nothing. He was introduced briefly as the new operations manager, which produced the polite non-committal response of a group that had learned not to react to new people until they understood who had sent them and why. He was on his second week when he found the first thread. It was in the vendor invoices. He'd requested access to the procurement records as part of getting up to speed on facility contracts, routine, unremarkable, the kind of request that should have taken a day to fulfill. It took 6. When the files finally came through, they were complete on the surface. But Ethan had managed building budgets long enough to know what healthy vendor billing looked like, and what he was reading did not look healthy. A medical supply company called Veristone Logistics appeared on 11 separate invoices across the last 18 months. Cleaning supplies, maintenance equipment, air filtration units. All of it plausible. All of it priced at roughly 30 to 40% above market rate. And all of it delivered according to the receiving logs to a warehouse address on the south side that Ethan did not recognize as a Sinclair Global property. He sat with it for 2 days. He pulled every public record he could find on Veristone Logistics. The company was registered in Delaware, 18 months old. No web presence beyond a bare-bones page with a contact form that returned no response when he tested it. The registered agent was a law firm that handled shell incorporations. On the 3rd day, he made a decision. He went to see Victoria. Sophie tried to manage him. She was good at it, a pleasant practiced efficiency that redirected most people before they realized they'd been redirected. Ethan waited her out with the particular patience of a man who had sat in hospital waiting rooms for hours, learning that urgency and noise were not the same thing. "I need 15 minutes," he said. "It's about the operations budget." Sophie looked at him. Then she picked up the phone. He got 10 minutes. Victoria's office was on the 44th floor, which meant 2 floors above where he worked every day and a different atmospheric pressure of authority. She was on a call when Sophie showed him in, and she held up one finger without looking at him. A gesture that managed to be neither rude nor apologetic, simply precise, and finished the call in 3 sentences that closed something at a significant dollar amount, without any apparent emotional engagement. She set the phone down and looked at him. He had been working in her building for 12 days. He'd seen her twice in that time, once in the elevator, where she had nodded at him in the way that acknowledged his presence without opening a conversation, and once in the lobby when she was leaving at the same moment he was arriving, and she had glanced at his notebook and said, "Still taking notes," and he'd said, "Always." And then the doors had separated them. She looked different up here in the full context of her own space. The desk was organized to an almost architectural precision. The windows behind her looked out over the lake, and the city spread wide beneath it. She inhabited the room the way people inhabit spaces they've had to earn rather than simply occupy. "You have 10 minutes, she said. "What did you find?" He put the printed invoices on her desk. He didn't editorialize. He walked her through the numbers, the way he'd have walked anyone through a budget discrepancy, clearly in order, letting the facts do the talking. She read everything twice. He knew she was a thorough reader because she didn't look up or ask questions until she'd gone through it all completely, which most people don't do. When she finally looked up, her face told him nothing useful. "How long have you had this?" she asked. "I confirmed it 3 days ago. I wanted to be sure before I brought it to you." "Why did you bring it to me directly? Your reporting line is Park." He looked at her steadily. "Because Veristone's invoices are all countersigned by Park." The silence that followed was the particular kind that forms when someone hears a thing they already suspected and are now being forced to stop suspecting and start knowing. Victoria set the papers down on her desk. She placed both hands flat on either side of them. She looked at the invoices as if they had said something she intended to answer. "How much?" she asked. "What I can document directly, a little over 2.4 million across the 18 months. But the pattern suggests it's been running longer than the records I have access to. If it goes back further," he paused, "it could be significantly more." She didn't react the way most people react to a number like that. She didn't recoil, or go pale, or make the sound of someone absorbing a blow. She went very still in the way Ethan was learning was her particular version of the same thing. "Who else knows you have this?" she asked. "No one. You haven't spoken to Hale anyone in legal HR?" "No." She looked at him. "Why not?" "Why? Because I don't know yet who's involved," he said. "And until I do, the fewer people who know I've been looking, the better." She held his gaze for a long moment. Something passed through her expression, not quite trust, because trust was not a thing she assembled quickly, but something that was in the same family. Recognition, maybe, of a person who understood that some rooms have to be navigated carefully, and who was navigating this one correctly. "Leave these with me," she said. "Don't access any more procurement records until I tell you to. And don't—" She stopped. Her voice, which had been crisp and even, dropped almost imperceptibly. "Don't talk to Park." "Understood." He was almost to the door. "Ethan." He turned. It was the first time she'd used his first name in this building. It landed differently than he expected. "Be careful," she said, not dramatically, like a fact being stated. He nodded and left. The retaliation did not announce itself. That was the thing about it. It came sideways through channels that were easy to dismiss individually. A parking violation appeared on his building access record that he hadn't received. An anonymous complaint was filed with HR claiming he'd spoken to a facilities vendor outside of proper procurement channels. When he went to retrieve the Veristone files from his desk drawer one Thursday morning, the drawer was unlocked and the files were in a different order than he'd left them. He took photos of everything. He started keeping a second notebook at home. And then it came through Ava. He was standing at the school gate at 3:14, 1 minute early. The way he always was when another father came to stand beside him. A man he recognized vaguely from drop-off. Someone whose son was in Ava's class. The man made small talk for 30 seconds, and then, in the voice of someone delivering a message, while pretending they aren't said, "Heard you landed something at Sinclair Global. Good for you. Though I have to say some of the parents are talking." Ethan looked at him. "About what?" The man shrugged with the body language of a person who has decided they're above what they're about to say, but is going to say it anyway. "You know, whether the CEO, given her situation, maybe made the hire for the wrong reasons, sympathy or whatever." He held up his hands. "Not my opinion. Just what people are saying." The gates opened. Children poured out. Ethan didn't respond. He watched for Ava's blue backpack in the crowd, found it tracked her small figure coming toward him, her face already moving into the particular brightness she reserved for the moment she spotted him. "Dad?" She ran the last few steps and hit him at a full, unself-conscious collision that he caught without staggering. He held on a beat longer than usual. "Good day?" he asked. "Medium," she said. "Jalen said my drawing of a horse looked like a dog, but I think it looked like a horse." "It looked like a horse," he said immediately. "That's what I said." He took her backpack, and they walked toward the L. The man at the gate had already moved on. Ethan did not look back at him, but he felt the words trailing behind him the whole way home, not because they stung the way they were intended to, but because they told him something important. Whoever was pushing back was no longer just pushing at him. They were trying to isolate Victoria. He understood it better 3 days later when he stayed late to finish a facilities audit on the 11th floor, and heard through the glass wall of a conference room he was passing the voice of Dennis Park in a conversation that was not meant to be overheard. He slowed without stopping. He kept his pace even and his face forward, and he listened to 8 seconds of a phone call as he passed. "She's not going to find anything she can use. Cole doesn't know enough yet, and if he gets too close, we remind the board what we've been building, the performance reviews, the attendance logs, all of it. A woman in that condition, running an operation this size. Ethan kept walking. He made it to the stairwell before he stopped. He stood in the stairwell and pressed his back against the wall and breathed. Not because he was afraid. He'd had the fear, processed it, and set it aside over the last 2 weeks as the shape of what he was dealing with became clearer. What stopped him now was something else. Something colder and more specific. A woman in that condition. He thought about her at the asphalt on Michigan Avenue, fighting to rise on arms alone because her legs would not, and the tremor in her hand that she was working so hard to suppress, and the way she'd said thank you to him in her office, like someone reading a phrase from a manual they'd never personally needed before. He thought about what she'd said to him in the conference room on his first day. I've spent every day since proving that assessment wrong. He thought about 8 seconds of a phone call in a glass-walled conference room. And then he opened his notebook to a fresh page, and he started writing down word for word everything he'd just heard. Because this was no longer just about contracts and shell companies and $2.4 million. This was about something they'd been constructing behind her back for a long time. A case. A narrative. A set of documents carefully arranged to tell a specific story about a woman whose only real vulnerability was that she had never been allowed to stop performing strength long enough to be honestly seen. They were going to use that against her. And Ethan Cole, a man who had arrived at this building 2 weeks ago with a damp resume and a daughter who believed in him more than he deserved, was not going to let that happen. He put the notebook in his inside jacket pocket close to his chest. He walked back down the stairs. He had work to do. He called Victoria at 9:17 that evening after Ava was asleep, standing in the kitchen the way he always stood when he needed to think, leaning against the counter with the lights low, the city outside the window doing its nighttime business 12 stories below. She answered on the second ring, which surprised him. He'd half expected to leave a message. "I need to see you tomorrow," he said. "Early, before the building fills up." A pause. Not hesitation. Processing. 7 o'clock, she said. "The side entrance on Wabash. Sophie will have a card for you." Okay. He was about to say something else. What exactly, he wasn't sure. Some version of, "I know what they're doing, and I'm not going to let it happen," when her voice came through first. Quieter than her office voice, quieter than her phone voice, the voice of someone calling from a private room at the end of a long day. "Ethan," she said. "Yeah." "Are you all right?" He stood in his kitchen in the dark and thought about that question for a moment, what it cost her to ask it, how foreign the direction of it must feel, she who was always the subject of everyone else's concern for all the wrong reasons, now asking it outward toward someone else. "I'm fine," he said. "I just needed to know you'd answer." Another pause. Something in it that neither of them reached toward yet, because this was not the moment, and they were both people who understood the weight of moments. "I'll see you at 7, she said. 7. He agreed. He stayed in the kitchen for a while after she hung up, listening to the quiet of the apartment, to Ava's breathing through the thin wall, to the city that didn't stop for any of it. Then he opened the notebook again and kept writing until midnight. He was at the Wabash entrance at 6:52. The card Sophie had left for him at the security desk worked on the first try, which felt like a small mercy, after the kind of night he'd had 3 hours of sleep. A notebook filled to its last page, and the specific alertness of a person running on something beyond caffeine, the kind that comes when the stakes have clarified and the path forward, however difficult, has finally revealed itself. The building was different at this hour. Quieter in a way that felt structural rather than simply empty, like it had a different personality before the workday populated it, something more honest. He took the elevator to 44 and found Victoria already there. She was at her desk. She'd been there a while. He could tell a coffee cup from somewhere outside the building sat cooling at her elbow, and there was a quality to her stillness that suggested she'd burned through the first layer of urgency an hour ago, and was now operating in the steadier, more dangerous territory beyond it. She looked up when he came in, took in his face. Whatever she saw there confirmed something she'd already suspected. "Tell me," she said. He told her everything. He laid the notebook open on her desk and walked her through it in the same order he'd assembled it: the padlocked storage room, the Veristone invoices, the retaliation sequence, the complaint filed with HR, the drawer that had been searched. And then the 8 seconds of Park's phone call that he'd written down word for word the moment he reached the stairwell. She read it, then she read it again. Her hands were flat on the desk, the way they'd been when he'd shown her the first invoices, the posture of someone anchoring themselves. "How much of this is documented?" she asked. "Not just your notes. Actual evidence I can use." "The invoices are documented. The receiving logs pointing to the off-site warehouse documented. I've got screenshots of the complaint filed against me, and timestamps showing it was submitted 40 minutes after I accessed the Veristone files. That's not proof of who filed it, but it's a sequence." He paused. "The phone call is just my notes. Your word against his?" "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "And you're certain about what you heard?" "Word for word," he said. "I wrote it the second I was out of the hallway." She looked at the notebook, at his handwriting across the page, compact, careful, the handwriting of someone who writes things down because they've learned that the things in your head disappear and the things on paper don't. "They're going to say you misheard," she said. "I know. They're going to say you have a motivation to fabricate that I hired you based on personal gratitude and you're trying to protect that. I know that too. They're building a file on me," she said. It wasn't a question anymore. She'd moved past the question stage into the operational stage. Performance reviews, medical leave records. They're going to take it to the board and make the case that my condition constitutes a material risk to the company's leadership stability. "That's what it sounded like," he said carefully. She said nothing for a moment. She looked out the window, not as if she was looking at anything specific, but the way people look away when they're feeling something they haven't decided yet to acknowledge. "They've been waiting for this," she said almost to herself. "Years. They've been patient about it. Build the file slowly. Never anything overt. Just accumulate. Wait." She paused. "And now I've handed them the perfect moment by opening a fraud investigation that threatens 8 figures of their side income. Victoria." He said her name the way she'd said his on the phone, not as a professional address, but as a way of landing in the actual conversation. "Whatever they have in that file, it can only work if you're already on the defensive, if you're already trying to prove something." She looked at him. "You said you spent every day since your father died proving the board's assessment wrong," he said. "That's the position they want you in. Always proving, always responding. Because when you're proving and responding, they control the frame." Her jaw tightened slightly. "You're suggesting I stop defending myself. I'm suggesting you go on offense instead." He leaned forward. "You have a fraud case. It's real, it's documented, and it connects directly to the senior operations staff they'd need to run any kind of coup. If you bring this to the board first, not in private, not in a quiet conversation over lunch, but formally on record in front of everyone, you change the entire geometry of this situation." She studied him for a long moment. "If I move too early," she said slowly, "before I have enough to be ironclad, they'll argue it's a witch hunt, that I'm targeting people who've raised legitimate concerns about my leadership." "Then we need more," he said. "How much time do we have?" "Board meeting is in 11 days. 11 days. He did the calculation without meaning to, the way his mind ran numbers automatically. 11 days, the building's procurement, records the off-site warehouse address, the Delaware registration of a shell company 18 months old. It was enough time, if nothing went sideways. "Then we use the 11 days, he said. She looked at him across her desk. This man she had known for 3 weeks, whom she'd pulled from a wet street and a ruined job interview and placed inside the walls of everything she'd spent a decade building. She had made decisions worth hundreds of millions of dollars in this chair. She had fired executives and restructured divisions and navigated board hostility with the composure of someone who had learned early that composure was a form of armor. She had never once, in any of it, had someone sitting across from her who was fighting for her, rather than for something she controlled. She wasn't entirely sure what to do with it. "All right," she said. 11 days. The warehouse on the south side was real. Ethan found it through a combination of city records, a freight carrier database he accessed through the facilities management software, and the kind of methodical patience that had served him through 7 years of tracking down leaks and faulty permits and contractors who billed for work they hadn't done. The address on Veristone's receiving logs resolved to a privately leased facility in the Pilsen neighborhood registered to a holding company that connected, through 2 layers of Delaware incorporation, to a personal LLC whose managing member was a name Ethan recognized. James Teller, board member. Sinclair Global, 12 years. He sat with that for a full hour before he moved. He checked it 3 times from 3 different angles and arrived at the same name all 3 times. Then he picked up the phone. "I need you to look at something," he said when Victoria answered. She came down to his floor for the first time since he'd started. He'd never seen her in this part of the building. She moved through it differently than she moved through 44, with a contained awareness, noting things. He showed her what he'd found on the screen without editorializing, just the chain of records laid out in sequence. She looked at it for a long time. "Teller," she said, very quietly. "Yes. He's been on the board since before my father died." She said it in the careful, distant tone of someone realizing that a timeline they thought they understood has just been extended backward. "I know. He was one of the people who argued hardest that I shouldn't take over after the funeral." Her voice didn't shake. It simply became very precise, the way voices become when the feeling behind them is too large to let any vibration through. "He told me at my father's funeral reception with a glass of wine in his hand that the company would be better served by an outside candidate, someone without the personal complications." She paused. "He meant the chair. He just didn't say it." Ethan said nothing. He let her have the moment without filling it. "He's been siphoning from the company he told me I wasn't capable of running," she said, "while telling the board I'm a liability." "Yes." She looked at Ethan. Something moved through her expression, not the sorrow of betrayal, because she had clearly operated for years in the knowledge that people like Teller existed. This was something different. The particular exhaustion of a person who has been proved right about something they desperately wished they'd been wrong about. "Okay," she said. She straightened. He watched her do it, the physical gathering, the armor resettling. "What do we still need?" He went through it. The warehouse records would document receipt of goods that weren't delivered to Sinclair Properties. They needed someone inside facilities to confirm the receiving logs were falsified. And they needed the financial trail between Teller's LLC and Veristone to be clean enough that the board's own legal counsel couldn't argue a gap. "The receiving logs," she said. "Marcus Webb. He's been on the dock crew for 4 years. He's filed 2 anonymous complaints through the ethics hotline in the last year, I know, because Sophie monitors the flagged submissions. Both of them referenced inventory discrepancies, and both of them were closed out by Park within 48 hours. She met Ethan's eyes. "If Webb is willing to talk on the record, I'll find him," Ethan said. He found Marcus Webb on the loading dock at 7:15 the following morning, before the day crew rotated in. Webb was in his 40s, broad-shouldered, with the face of a man who had done physical work his whole life, and had opinions about people who hadn't. He looked at Ethan the way new managers are always initially looked at on a loading dock, with the particular skepticism of someone who has been introduced to enough people from upstairs to have stopped expecting much from them. "You the new ops manager?" Webb said. "Yeah," Ethan said. "I want to ask you about some inventory records, but I want to be straight with you first." He looked at him directly. "I know you filed 2 complaints through the ethics line. I know they were killed, and I think you already know who killed them." Webb was quiet for a moment. He looked at the dock door, at the middle distance, at something that wasn't there. "What happens if I talk to you?" he said. "I take it to Sinclair, directly, with everything else I already have." Ethan paused. "You won't be doing this alone. That's not how this works." You sure about that? I'm sure that what's happening in this building isn't going to stay hidden for the next 11 days, Ethan said. It's going to come out one way or another. The question is whether the people who've been doing the right thing get to be part of the way it comes out, or whether they're still standing on the sidelines when it does. Webb looked at him for a long weighing moment. The receiving logs, Webb said finally. The Veristone shipments. Half of them never came through this dock. He said it flatly, like a man reading from something he'd had memorized for a long time. I signed nothing. Park's signature on those receiving logs, that's not procedure. Dock crew chief signs. I'm the dock crew chief. I never signed for any of it. He paused. I've got my own copies of the actual delivery records. I've been keeping them at home. Ethan breathed slowly. Can you get them to me? I'll have them tonight. Webb studied him. You're really going to take this to Sinclair? I already did, Ethan said. She's the one who sent me to find you. Something shifted in Webb's face. Something that had been braced for a long time loosened just slightly at its edges. The night before the board meeting, Ethan was still in the building at 10 p.m. He'd sent Ava to her friend Mia's house for the night, a fact that had produced a level of excitement in Ava entirely disproportionate to the circumstances, and which he'd been grateful for. He didn't want her home alone while he was doing this, and he didn't want to explain why. He was on the 44th floor, the only light still burning on this side of the building, going through the compiled evidence with Victoria and the outside legal counsel she had quietly engaged 3 days ago. A woman named Patricia Osei, who had the kind of calm that suggested she had walked into difficult rooms many times and had never yet been the one who didn't walk back out. It was Patricia who said at 10:47, after reviewing the complete file, "This is enough. This is more than enough." Victoria was at her desk. She had not moved from it in the last 2 hours. She had a glass of water she hadn't touched, and a quality of concentration so total that Ethan had stopped narrating his own thoughts around her and simply handed her documents and waited. She looked at Patricia. The board can still argue the circumstances of how the evidence was gathered. They can try, Patricia said. But the receiving logs, corroborated by a 12-year employee who kept his own contemporaneous records cross-referenced against freight carrier data and a corporate registration trail to a sitting board member, they would need a very particular kind of courage to argue that in a room that will shortly include federal investigators. You've contacted the FBI field office, Victoria said. 2 days ago, Patricia said. They are interested. The room was quiet. Victoria set her hands flat on the desk. She looked at the organized stacks of documents in front of her. Everything Ethan had gathered. Everything Webb had provided. Everything Patricia had structured into a legal narrative that could survive contact with people whose job it was to dismantle it. She looked at Ethan. He was leaning against the window, his jacket off the small notebook from the Walgreens still in his shirt pocket. He looked tired in the way that isn't defeat, but is something close to its opposite. The exhaustion of someone who has used every available resource and hasn't quit. If this goes sideways tomorrow, she said to him quietly, while Patricia organized papers on the side table. You lose the job. You potentially get tied up in whatever counter-narrative they construct. And you've been in this building for less than a month. There are people on that board who will say you're an opportunist. That I'm an easy mark. That this whole thing is... I know what they'll say, he said. Then why? Victoria. He said it gently, not cutting her off, just stopping the question before she finished it, because the question had an answer that was simpler and more complete than anything the next minute of conversation could contain. You know why. She looked at him. The lamp on her desk lit her face from one side, the way evening light does when the world outside has gone dark. She looked in this moment like exactly what she was, a person who was tired. Not of working, not of fighting. Tired of carrying everything alone in a building full of people who had never not once chosen her over their own calculations. She looked at him, and he looked back, and in the space between them was everything that had accumulated in 3 weeks of shared purpose, the 7 a.m. meetings, the phone call where she'd asked if he was all right, The way she'd said his name in the stairwell of the 42nd floor on his first day, as if she was checking that he was real. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. She turned back to Patricia. "Tomorrow," she said. Her voice was level and clear. "We go in at 9. Batsatar." He left the building at 11:30. The city at this hour was a different city. Quieter, more honest, the streets belonging to the people who actually lived in them, rather than moving through them. He walked to the L and took it north, and then sat in the apartment with the lights off and the notebook in his hands. He thought about Lily, about how she used to say that the days that cost the most were always the ones that mattered. She had said it about labor, and about the day they buried her mother, and about the week she spent in the hospital the first time, when they still believed it was something they could outmaneuver. She'd said it as a comfort, and it was the way truths you can't argue with are a strange kind of comfort. He thought about Ava asleep at Mia's house, who had said they will the morning of the interview with the absolute certainty of someone who understood things about her father that he didn't yet understand about himself. He thought about a woman on wet asphalt, fighting to rise on arms alone, and a wheelchair he'd righted with both hands, and a question he'd been trying to locate ever since the moment he'd chosen, and how he still couldn't find it, because it still didn't feel like a choice. He put the notebook on the table. He set his alarm. Tomorrow the board would convene at 9. He'd be in the building at 7. Old habit. He was in the building at 6:58, not 7. 6:58, because the alarm had gone off at 5:30, and he'd been awake since 4, lying in the dark the way he'd lain in the dark on the morning of the interview, staring at the ceiling. Except this time, he wasn't counting his breathing. This time he was running through every document in sequence, every name in the chain, every possible counter-argument, and how Patricia had already addressed it. Until the sequence was so familiar, it moved through his mind like a river that had found its channel and stopped needing to search for the way down. He picked up Ava from Mia's house at 6:15. She came out still half asleep, backpack hanging off one shoulder, hair unbrushed, and she walked directly into him and pressed her face against his jacket, and didn't say anything for a full 30 seconds, which was the best thing that had happened in the last 48 hours. "Big day," she said into his lapel. She could read him the way her mother had read him, not through anything he said, but through something in the quality of his stillness. "Yeah," he said. "Good big or bad big?" He thought about that honestly. "I don't know yet." She pulled back and looked at him, 8 years old, her mother's eyes. "You'll be okay," she said. Again with that absolute, unargued certainty that he had never once deserved and had never once stopped needing. He dropped her at school and watched her go through the doors, and then he stood on the sidewalk for a moment in the early morning and breathed. 4 counts in. Hold. 6 counts out. Then he went to work. Day. Patricia was already on 44 when he arrived. She had the documents organized in a sequence that told the story the way a good story needs to be told, not all at once, but in the order that allows each piece to land before the next one arrives. She had a quality of readiness that Ethan recognized from his years managing crisis situations in buildings, the particular calm of someone who has done their preparation and is now simply waiting for the moment to execute it. Victoria came out of her private office at 8:15. She was dressed in a way Ethan had not seen her dressed before, not the severe professional black she wore as armor, but something quieter. A deep charcoal gray. Understated. As if she had made a deliberate decision about what she wanted to communicate before she said a single word. She moved through the room with her usual precision and stopped when she reached the table where Ethan and Patricia were standing. She looked at Ethan first. "How are you?" she asked. "Ready," he said. She nodded once. Then she looked at the organized files on the table, and something moved across her face. The briefest acknowledgement of what it had taken to assemble what was sitting there, the weeks, the risk. The man who had built it piece by piece in a notebook from the Walgreens. "Then let's go," she said. The boardroom on the 46th floor seated 16. 12 board members were present, which meant 12 people who had varying degrees of knowledge about what was coming, ranging from complete ignorance to the specific guilty awareness of people who had convinced themselves that awareness and participation were different things. James Teller was at the far end of the table. He was 63, silver-haired, and wore the composed expression of a man who had spent a long career being the most powerful person in most rooms. He looked at Victoria when she came in. Then he looked at Ethan. Something moved behind his eyes. Not fear exactly, but its precursor. The moment when a calculation that seemed solid begins to develop a hairline crack. Richard Hale was there. Dennis Park was conspicuously absent, which meant someone had already told him something. That was information too. Victoria took her position at the head of the table without preamble. She looked around the room once, not performing the look, just actually seeing who was there. And then she said, "I'm calling this meeting to order. I have a matter of urgent business that supersedes the scheduled agenda. Patricia Osei, our outside legal counsel, will present the documentation. I'll speak after." Teller straightened slightly. "Victoria, I think it would be appropriate to, James." Her voice was level, not raised, simply immovable. "You'll have time to speak. After the presentation." The room recalibrated. Ethan stood to the side, not at the table. He was not a board member and had not been invited to sit, but Patricia had positioned him where he could see every face in the room, which was the point. He watched them as Patricia began. She was extraordinary at it. She didn't editorialize. She laid the documents in sequence, explained each connection in plain language, allowed the logic of the chain to do its own persuasion. The Veristone invoices. The receiving logs bearing Park's signature versus Webb's actual records. The Delaware registration. The freight carrier database. The holding company. Teller's personal LLC. She put Teller's name on the screen at the 11-minute mark. The room did not explode. Rooms like this rarely do. What happened instead was a specific quality of silence that is different from ordinary silence. A silence with weight and heat in it. The silence of 12 people simultaneously recalculating everything. Teller said, "This is fabricated." He said it with confidence. The confidence of a man who had spent 11 years cultivating the authority to say things with confidence and have them received as truth. The documentation comes from city property records, a publicly accessible freight carrier database, and Delaware corporate registration filings, Patricia said without any particular heat. We also have corroborating testimony from a 12-year employee with his own contemporaneous records of actual receiving transactions that do not match the logs submitted to accounting. She paused. The FBI field office has been briefed. They find the documentation sufficient. The confidence left Teller's face. Not all at once. In the way air leaves something that's been punctured slowly, and then all at once. One of the other board members, a woman named Carol Ashby, who had always voted pragmatically, and whose pragmatism now clearly reassessed its direction, said quietly, "How long has this been running?" "Based on what we can document directly," Patricia said, 22 months. "Based on the pattern of the shell company's activity, potentially longer." Hale had not spoken. He was looking at his hands on the table. Ethan watched him and thought he knew. Not everything, but enough. The look of a man who had told himself for 2 years that what he didn't participate in directly wasn't his responsibility was a specific look, and Hale was wearing it completely. Then Victoria spoke. She hadn't spoken since she called the meeting to order. She'd sat at the head of the table and watched Patricia work and watched the room respond, and she had not moved, had not reacted, had not given Teller or Hale or anyone else the satisfaction of seeing her absorb this, the way they expected her to absorb things defensively, emotionally in a way that could later be characterized as exactly the kind of instability they'd been carefully documenting. She spoke now. "I want to address something that isn't in Patricia's documentation," she said, "because the documents cover the fraud. They don't cover the other part." She looked around the table. "Some of you have been receiving assessments, informal ones, carefully worded about my fitness to lead this company. My attendance at certain events. My use of medical leave. Characterizations of decisions I've made that reframed them as emotional rather than strategic." She paused. I know this because I have been aware of it for longer than you might expect. I chose not to address it directly because I calculated correctly. I think that addressing it directly would play into the narrative it was designed to create. The room was completely still. I am disabled, she said. Clearly, without apology or performance. Just a fact being stated by someone who has decided that facts belong in the room. I live with chronic pain every day. There are days it is manageable, and days it is not. There are things I cannot do that other people can do without thinking about it. None of that has prevented me from running this company. It has not prevented me from growing revenue by 31% since I took over. It has not prevented me from identifying and pursuing the largest fraud this company has faced in its history. She let that land. What it has done is give certain people a convenient handle, a word they could use privately to raise doubt, to build a file to slowly construct a story in which my disability was evidence of incompetence rather than simply a fact about my body. Teller started to say something. "I'm not finished, James," she said. Calm, absolute. He stopped. "I have spent 6 years in this chair proving that I deserve to sit at this table," she said. "I am done proving it. Not because I've given up, because it was never the right standard. You don't ask the people who aren't disabled to prove they deserve to be here. You don't require them to perform strength continuously as the price of being taken seriously." She looked around the room one more time. "I built this company with you. I intend to keep building it. But I will not spend another 6 years managing your discomfort with who I am as a precondition of doing my job." Nobody said anything. Not Teller, whose face had passed through confidence and arrived somewhere considerably quieter. Not Hale, who was still looking at his hands. Not the 11 other people in the room who were witnesses to a woman deciding in real time to stop performing invulnerability as a survival strategy, and finding against all expectation that the room did not collapse around her when she did. Carol Ashby said, "I'd like to call for an immediate vote to authorize full cooperation with the federal investigation and to temporarily suspend the board members named in the documentation pending the outcome." Someone seconded it before she finished the sentence. The vote was 11-1. Teller did not vote. Walk. It took 3 hours. Federal investigators arrived at 1:15. Park was located in the building and escorted to a conference room on 12. Teller left with his attorney, which he had apparently thought to have on standby. Hale submitted a voluntary statement that attempted in the careful language of a man consulting his own legal interests in real time to establish the precise boundary of what he'd known versus what he'd participated in directly. Ethan spent most of those 3 hours in the 44th floor waiting area, answering questions when asked and staying out of the way when not. Marcus Webb arrived at 2 o'clock, accompanied by his own counsel, a detail Ethan had helped arrange because Webb had built walls around himself for 4 years and deserved to walk into this with someone in his corner. At 3:47, Ethan looked at his phone and stood up. Sophie appeared in the doorway. "Where are you?" "School pickup," he said. "It's 3:47. She stared at him. "There are still federal investigators on the premises. Victoria is..." "Sophie." He said it gently. "It's 3:47. Sophie closed her mouth. Then, after a moment, something in her expression shifted into something that might, in different circumstances, have been a smile. He took the elevator down. Yeg. Ava was at the gate. She scanned the crowd for him with the particular focused attention of a child who has learned not to take for granted that the person she's waiting for will appear, and when she found him, her whole face did the thing. It did the thing he lived for, the brightening that had nothing performed in it. She ran the last steps. He caught her. "You smell like a building," she said into his shoulder. "I've been in a building all day." Did the big day go okay? He held on for a moment. The afternoon was doing something gentle with the light, the way Chicago light behaves in late spring. When it finally remembers, it can be warm. He thought about the boardroom. About Patricia saying the FBI finds the documentation sufficient. About Victoria at the head of the table saying, "I am disabled," the way you say something that has always been true, but that you have finally decided belongs in the room with everything else. "Yeah," he said. It went okay. Ava pulled back and looked at him with the evaluative precision she'd inherited from her mother. Better than okay. He looked at her. Better than okay, he said. She nodded satisfied and took his hand, and they walked toward the El Maune. Months passed. The federal investigation moved at the pace. Federal investigations move methodically, without drama, assembling its own chain of evidence from the foundation Ethan had laid. Teller was indicted on 7 counts of wire fraud and 1 count of securities manipulation. Park accepted a plea agreement. Hale resigned and was not prosecuted, though the word resigned in his case was doing the work of several harder words that more precisely described what had happened. Sinclair Global did not collapse. It did not falter. What it did in the months following the board meeting was something quieter and more durable. It steadied. The particular instability that comes from a building's hidden rot being finally exposed and removed is not comfortable, but it is real, and what remains after it is load-bearing in a way the rot never was. Victoria restructured the operations division. She promoted Marcus Webb to operations supervisor, which he accepted with the restrained satisfaction of a man who has waited a long time for an obvious thing to finally happen. She brought in 2 new board members, one of whom used a cane, and the other of whom had the practical, unglamorous competence of people who have spent their careers solving actual problems rather than managing their proximity to power. Ethan stayed. He hadn't expected to feel uncertain about that. The job was the job, and he was good at it. And Ava no longer asked whether they were going to be okay, which was the only metric that had ever truly mattered. But there was a different uncertainty that arrived in the months after the board meeting, more slowly and more privately, in the small accumulations of time he spent with Victoria that were not the job. The 7 a.m. meetings that continued after the crisis had passed. The evening phone calls that started about logistics and ended about other things. The Sunday in October when he brought Ava to the building because he had to check on a contractor, and Victoria was there unexpectedly. And Ava, who had heard his end of enough phone calls to have formed opinions, marched directly up to Victoria's wheelchair and said, "You're Miss Victoria. Dad talks about you. I'm Ava." Victoria had looked at this small, direct person who had materialized in front of her and said with the careful precision of someone unused to children but unwilling to condescend to them, "I know. He talks about you too." Ava had considered this. "Do you want to see my drawing of a horse? Dad says it looks like a horse, but Jalen says it looks like a dog." Victoria had looked at the drawing Ava produced from her backpack with the seriousness it apparently deserved. "It looks like a horse," she said. Ava turned to Ethan with an expression of complete vindication. "See?" He had laughed. Actually laughed the full kind. The kind that comes from somewhere that has been closed off for long enough that its opening is a surprise. Victoria had looked at him when he laughed, and in her face was something he'd been watching grow slowly over months. The way things grow when they've been kept from light for a long time and are finally allowed at something open. Something that did not immediately know what to do with itself, but was learning. She had dinner with them that evening. It was the first time. Ava talked the entire meal with the unself-conscious energy of a child who has decided someone belongs in her orbit and is not interested in the formalities of how that happened. Victoria listened in a way that suggested she was storing everything, not calculating, just receiving the way someone receives something they didn't know they'd been missing until it was in front of them. When Ava fell asleep on the couch afterward, a thing that happened suddenly and completely, the way children sleep. Victoria sat across from Ethan in the quiet of the apartment, and they talked in the low voices of people trying not to wake a sleeping child, which has its own particular intimacy. "She's extraordinary," Victoria said. "She is," Ethan agreed. "She gets it from somewhere." He looked at her. She was looking at Ava, the small sleeping figure with one arm thrown over her face, and the expression on Victoria's face was the most unguarded he had ever seen it. No armor, no composition, just a woman sitting in a warm apartment looking at a sleeping child and feeling something she didn't have a prepared response for. "Victoria," he said quietly. She looked at him. There were things he could have said. He'd been building the vocabulary for them for months, in the way he built everything methodically, honestly, one piece at a time. But some things don't need the full structure before they can be said. Some things are already true before you find the language for them. I'm glad I dropped the folder, he said. She looked at him for a long moment. Outside, the city moved in its nighttime way. Ava breathed softly on the couch. The lamp on the table made the room small and warm. And Victoria Sinclair, who had built $1 billion company in a wheelchair, who had outlasted every person who had bet against her, who had learned so thoroughly to hide behind competence and composure that she'd nearly lost track of the woman living behind them, did something she had not done in front of another person in longer than she could accurately remember. She smiled. Not the professional smile, not the controlled, calibrated expression deployed in boardrooms. The other kind. The kind that comes from somewhere beneath strategy and survival, from whatever part of a person remains when all the proving is finally done. So am I, she said. The last image is a rooftop on an evening in late spring. The river below the city around it, the sky doing something unhurried with its light. Victoria's wheelchair beside the railing. Ethan next to her. Ava asleep against his shoulder, her breath slow and even, her face slack with the absolute peace of a child who has decided without analysis or doubt that she is safe. No speeches, no declarations, no neat resolution of everything that remains unresolved because life doesn't offer those, and neither of them would trust something that did. Just three people who came to each other through wreckage, through grief and fraud and wet asphalt, and a folder blowing down a Chicago street, and found in each other something that could not have been planned or deserved or strategically acquired. They found home. And the truest thing about all of it, the thing that holds the whole story together from its first moment to its last, is this. The man who had nothing left to lose turned out to be the only one with enough left to give. And the woman the world had spent years trying to diminish turned out to be the one strong enough to save them both.